pressing once you're plugged in.
Good mechanical things. He's not too good either. Oh, there's Sonia.
Good evening. My name is Matt Anestis, and I'm the chair of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics. And I'd like to welcome you here to our personal perspectives, which we put on at the beginning of each semester with our new fellows. We are absolutely thrilled and honored to have the group of fellows we have this semester, and this is a great way to get to know them. I hope you all take advantage of them this semester, both with their study groups, which there are sign-up sheets for right over there, and just coming to see them and making sure that you make their stay as wonderful for them as it will be for us. I will turn this over now to the director of the Institute, who is Charlie Royer, who was mayor of Seattle, land of rain, before he came here to be director in the land of snow. So with no further ado, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Matt, and welcome to all of you. Our fellows indeed are an interesting group, and this evening is designed to give them some time with you to talk about their study groups. The study group brochure that's available over by the door looks like this. We hope you'll do some research into what each of these fellows is doing with his or her study group, and then take advantage of this really unique part of the programming of the Institute of Politics. Tonight, our fellows are from my right and your left: Don Fraser, Bo Bolter, Kim Campbell, Kate Michaelman, Victor Navasky, and Alice Wolf. I'll introduce each of them just briefly before they speak for a few minutes, and then we'll take some time at the end of the program, which will end at 7:30, to answer any questions and respond to any questions that any of you might have. Don Fraser, believe it or not, tonight is going to get on an airplane and go back out to Minneapolis. He has an engagement there. He wants to go someplace where it's warm, so he chose Minneapolis. And, so we'll be leaving as soon as he delivers himself of his introductory remarks. He'll be leaving to go out to Logan. I'm sure that our hearts are all with him on this. Don is somebody I've known for a long time. He has a long and distinguished political career. Member of Congress, mayor of Minneapolis, member of his state senate in Minnesota, president of the National League of Cities. His study group is, however, drawing on his experience when he was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House and chair of the House Subcommittee on Human Rights. His subcommittee is going to be called Defining and Defending Human Rights, and he is most able to shed some light on that very critical subject area for you in this study group. So please help me welcome Don Fraser.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and students, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm sorry that I'm going to disappear when I'm through, but I made a commitment that I need to try to keep, and so I'll go out to the airport to see what's happening. I have served for the last 14 years as mayor of the city of Minneapolis, and that job ended about 30 days ago. I ran into one of my constituents on the street the other day, and he walked up to me and he says, "Gee," he said, "you look familiar. Didn't you used to be somebody?" I had a struggle while I was mayor with the structure of our city. We are known as a weak mayor system, and when I took the job in 1980, that was the reality, and I struggled with it for a while, and then I got some charter changes approved by the voters. But it seemed that the voters really weren't impressed, and not too long before I quit, I had a call from someone asking if I could arrange to have their garbage picked up. And I thanked them for the call and said, "We're happy to be of service," but I said, "You know, you could have called your council member, or you could have called the solid waste division." Yeah, the fellow said, I know I could have done that, but he said I didn't want to go over your head. So my public service has been a series of narrow escapes. When I first ran for the legislature, barely won by, I think, about 0.5%. I ran for Congress, won by the same overwhelming margin. Then I ran for the United States Senate and lost by the same margin. And the only secure harbor I've been in has been the mayor's job. I shouldn't have quit. My study group is on the subject of international human rights, and I wanted to say a word about why that, for me, is an important subject. I came to chair the subcommittee on international organizations on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and was acutely aware that the liberals were complaining a lot about United States policy that was supporting the Greek colonels in Greece after they took power, or that we were supporting Pinochet in Chile after Allende was ousted and killed, or we were supporting right-wingers in the Dominican Republic. Well, that was the liberal posture. The conservatives, on the other hand, were critics of the left-leaning regimes. And it seemed to me that there ought to be some common ground if our concerns about what was happening to people was grounded in some kind of ethics or morality. And so I launched a year-long study into the subject of United States foreign policy and international human rights. And what happened was I found a whole new world, a world filled with international conventions and covenants and treaties, a UN system quite elaborated to deal with human rights issues. In Europe, a human rights court, a human rights commission, a human rights convention as a follow-on to the Nazi period. And I became convinced that American policy indeed needed to reflect human rights concerns more directly than it had in the past. And in fact, I think it's worked out. Even during the Reagan years, oh, I shouldn't put it that way. Fortunately.
Why not?
Why not?
Here we go again.
Here we go. I'm a Democrat, in case I hadn't said that. In any event, the idea of human rights, how governments treat people, has survived as an important idea. And President Carter put it on the top of the agenda. It's dropped a little bit, but it still remains a really important, I think, organizing concept when we think about how to organize this world. And so my hope is that those of you who decide to join this study group on international human rights will work with us as we think through that idea as a basic organizing way of thinking about how to organize the future of the world. So I'm happy to be here. I look forward to a vigorous interaction with the students. And I don't know why I had to come to Boston to get Minnesota weather. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And Don, as with all our fellows, is housed on the first floor of the Institute of Politics. You're invited to stop by and say hello if you have any questions. Because Don won't be able to be with us for the end of this program, you're sure welcome to stop by and say hello to him in his office. And you may make your graceful exit at this moment. Thank you, Don, very much. Have a good trip, safe trip. Another member of Congress, former member of Congress with us in this group of fellows is from the other end of the political spectrum, from Don Frazier. He is Bo Bolter, a Republican from West Texas who ran against a senator named Lloyd Bentsen in 1988. And is therefore now running a consulting firm and is here as a fellow. He brings experience from the House in budget cutting in the Grace Committee, which was aimed at reducing government expenditures. He is drawing really on his new life in international consulting to fashion a study group around international trade as foreign policy. Dollar diplomacy, international trade as foreign policy. Would you please welcome from West Texas, Bo Bolter.
Thank you, Charlie, very much. I think the thing that I would want you to know more than anything else about me is that I am from West Texas, as Charlie said. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean much, except it does mean that, if you grow up in West Texas and live there all your life, you like people. And so I want you to know that my office will always be open to you. I want you to come in and talk with me about whatever it is you want to talk about. I would be delighted if you want to come in and talk about international trade. That is what my study group is going to be about. As Charlie indicated, but didn't come right out and say forthrightly, is in teaching the study group on international trade, I will not be drawing a great deal on past experience because I don't have a lot of past experience at international trade. I hope that will not dissuade any of you from coming in. My background is political. I mean, it is West Texas, hard-fought politics with some victories and losses and a lot of scars and a lot of battles and a lot of fun. For those of you who are interested in politics, and I take it that most of you are, many on this stage and Mickey Edwards out there, whom I love all the more because he is a Republican. You still are, aren't you, Mickey? You know, back home, I got a call from Texas today, and I was told that in the Texas Weekly, that's this political rag, that they're still amazed that I'm at Harvard. Well, I want you to know I'm equally amazed that I'm here. But I am a Republican, and I do stand up for what I believe, I hope in a tasteful manner. I love my fellow fellows. Really getting close to some of them, that bothers some of my friends, but I think it's all going to work out real well. Now, having said that I've gone through the political wars, earlier this year, or actually later last year, my partner, Lance Torrance, and I decided to put together a political consulting firm. He is in Beijing, China. And so our emphasis in my class might tend to be a little bit on the Asian Pacific region of the world because that's where we expect to do most of our business. But also being from Texas, I also have an interest in Mexico and Latin America and South America. I think that trade is very, very exciting. It's not only exciting for me, but in a world that is becoming increasingly a world without economic borders, I think that that's where our future is. And I believe that people profit from a free exchange of ideals and sharing with each other, and that goes for goods and services and products as well. So I think the fewer barriers we have, the better off all people will be. And I'm very interested in the concept of free trade, also how to make it work for our country and for all people. So if you're interested in this area, not so much the technicalities, but trade is a tool of foreign policy, then I hope you will come and attend our class. I know that you would add a lot, and come see me and talk to me about it.
Thank you, Bill. The first woman to serve as Prime Minister of Canada has a... Oh, there might be a few Canadians here tonight. The first woman to serve as a Prime Minister of Canada, Kim Campbell, has a long list of firsts in her political career, which started out on the Vancouver, British Columbia School Board. That's the second most beautiful city in the great Pacific Northwest. Her study group, a study of democracy at work in Canada and the United States, will draw on that experience in that intergovernmental system in Canada, and hopefully will help to explain how processes in both those countries affect the making of public policy. We look very much forward to Kim Campbell being with us this semester, and please welcome her to the forum.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here. When we had a luncheon in our orientation week last week. We were asked what it was that brought us into politics, and I could only account for my entry into politics by a recessive gene, because I can't really explain, except that I was always very interested in social issues, and particularly international politics. In my first career, in fact, I did graduate work in Soviet government and taught at the University of British Columbia. And I ran for public office in 1980 for the Vancouver School Board the same year I entered law school, so I'm trained as a lawyer as well. And I've served at the local, the provincial, I was a member of my provincial legislature, and federal level. But the thing that has always interested me is this question of how to govern in a way that best translates the democratic ideal into reality. And in the last 5 years, as a member of the Government of Canada, I've been the Junior Minister of Indian Affairs. I was our Minister of Justice and Attorney General, the first woman to hold that portfolio, and the first woman to be the Minister of National Defense, as well as the first woman to be Prime Minister. But I've had a chance to see some of the major issues facing our societies up close. And what I'm looking forward to doing here in my own work, in addition to working on a book on my time in Ottawa, is to pick some brains around the Harvard area, and many of them are in this room, about the whole question of how we find something called the public interest and how we can make democracy work for our societies in the 1990s and the 21st century, how we can get beyond political processes that are designed solely to enable people to articulate their own views of their conception of their rights and get beyond that to some sense of consensus building. I had a chance to work with a lot of those issues firsthand, particularly as Justice Minister in Canada. And that's why I wanted to devote my study group to some of those tough issues that really test the ability of a society to find common ground, to be able to use its legislative processes in a constructive way. I think in the United States you have a habit that we're finding growing more and more in Canada as we have a substantive Charter of Rights in our Constitution. We've had it there since 1982. And that is a tendency to perhaps let the courts deal with the tough issues, because legislators are unable to get beyond narrow interests or be able to find that kind of common ground. I think that's very dangerous for democracy. In our study group, we're going to look at some of these tough issues, these issues that really test our ability as a society to create consensus, and issues which have been dealt with quite differently in Canada than in the United States. And I hope that Canadians will find this an interesting opportunity to look objectively at their own society, but also that Americans will have a chance to see how your closest neighbor has been able to deal with these issues. I think one of the great advantages of the Canadian-American relationship is that we have enough in common to benefit from one another's experiences, but we are very different countries, and I think that will become very clear in the course of the study group. I start with the premise that Canada is not just a smaller, quieter version of the United States, that we have a very different political culture. And I think some of the things about it, some of the Canadian attitudes may well surprise you if you're not familiar with your northern neighbor. So we're going to look at issues like health care and campaign financing, which are not issues that I dealt with personally as a portfolio politician, but were part of very great priorities both at the federal and provincial levels. But some other issues that I dealt with directly as a minister, the gay rights, gays in the military, abortion, gun control, and women's rights and pornography. And I think those are issues which will continue to be on the front burner of both of our societies. We've had some very interesting experiences with them in Canada, and I'm really looking forward to discussing them with you and to learning a great deal. And I think that it is an opportunity, as I say, for us to learn more about our respective countries and perhaps to gain some insight on how we as societies can transcend narrow interests and begin to create vibrant, dynamic, and effective legislative processes that really empower people in modern democracy. So I look forward to seeing you there.
Thanks, Kim. Since 1985, Kate Michaelman has been president of the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, most recently renamed. And probably nobody is better prepared to lead a study group on the politics of this issue than NARAL's fundraiser, organizer, political strategist, lobbyist, the all-around utility infielder of this issue across the country for the last 9 years. So would you please welcome, as an Institute Fellow, Kate Michaelman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I must say at the outset how excited I am to be here with you, with my fellows. It's just an extraordinary opportunity to step back a bit and think about what I'm doing and how I'm doing this. I worry a little bit about the title of my study group because I think it may sound to people like, oh, ho-hum, you know, we're all 20 of us going to get together and all think alike and have a boring time. I think the title doesn't reflect the human element of the issue and some of the other sides of the issue. And I want you to know that I want very much to make this study group an inquiry into some of the difficult questions around reproductive choice. But I just want to spend a moment with you explaining a bit on a personal level why I am so passionate about this issue, both from a personal perspective as well as a political one, and why I believe that reproductive choice is fundamental to the quality of our lives, to women's lives. It's central to our lives, and central to our lives as families and as a community and as a nation, if not the world, that I think we've not taken reproduction seriously enough. But I want to tell you a personal story that perhaps will give resonance as to why I understand this issue the way I do. Before Roe versus Wade, as you know, there were countless women who faced a very devastating experience in their lives, women who faced a crisis pregnancy, who made moral decisions about their lives and were not able to exercise that choice in a safe, humane, dignified way. Women who faced the specter of unsafe back alley abortions. I was one of those women. In 1970, I had been married. I had 3 daughters, 3 daughters in 3 years, 3 wonderful daughters. I was raised a Catholic, very strong Catholic background. My husband one day announced to me that he was leaving me and my children. I obviously was very devastated. My world crashed in on me. A woman at that time, a woman who grew up in the 50s, understood her role and her value and her worth, many of us, I shouldn't speak for all of us, but many of us, as being a homemaker, wanted by a man, a mother. And when you are rejected by someone that you love very much, it's not only devastating in a sort of family sense, it's devastating personally, because you wonder what your worth is all about. In any case, I was in a situation where my husband left. I had no money, I had no car, I had no anything. And I had 3 children, and I found I was pregnant again. And I had to face an extremely difficult decision. I think most women don't ever plan to have an abortion. It's not something women set out to do in their lives. It's not an experience we say we need to fulfill our lives, that gosh, this is something we're going to go out and do, get pregnant so we can have an abortion in order to feel fulfilled. That's not what it's like. I, like many women, never thought I would have to face the decision about whether or not to have an abortion, but I did have to face it. I had to face it because my children, when my husband left, had only me to depend on for their emotional, their physical, their financial, their very beings. I was it. They had nothing else. I was the sole person that was going to keep the family together. And in fact, I believe my family was threatened with being pulled apart because it was such a devastating time of our lives. I had to go on welfare. And while I was examining this decision about whether or not to have an abortion, I confronted some of the most difficult moral, philosophical, religious, ethical issues. I had to balance the value that I saw in my own born children and the responsibility I had to those born children with the responsibility I had to this developing fetus. And frankly, the value of that, the lives of my children had to, or came certainly ahead as I examined it, of the value of that developing fetus. That I knew if I had another child, I would be completely incapable of managing the putting of my family's life back together. So I decided, after a very difficult time, to have an abortion. I did this alone. In 1970, abortion was illegal. I couldn't tell my family because it would have been devastating to my family. I was really alone. But I made that decision because it was the most moral decision I could make. When I tried to get an abortion, I found, and I wanted to have a hospital abortion, not a back alley abortion. I found that in order to do that, because abortion was illegal, I had to try and achieve what is called a therapeutic abortion then, in 1970. I was forced to go before a hospital-appointed panel of 4 men, doctors, who examined me, required me to talk about the most intimate details of my life, had to reveal much about me, and almost forced me to have to prove that I was mentally unbalanced in order for them to decide that my choice that I'd already made, a moral choice to care for my family, that choice was okay, that I could go and act on it. I mean, I had the responsibility of my family. I had to live with the decision. But these men, and I don't mean to sound anti-male here, I'm not. I'm just trying to tell you what it was like. They made that decision for me. Finally, after much difficulty, they did decide to allow me to have the abortion. I went into the hospital, and into the room walks a nurse who says that they forgot one more legal detail. I had to have my husband's written permission before I could have this abortion. Excuse me, by the way, I have a very bad cold. I literally had to get out of the bed, walk out of the hospital, go and find the man who left me and my children and left us destitute, really, and get his written permission to have this abortion. I don't need to tell you how humiliating and degrading that was. I came back, I had the abortion, I was a single mom, and I had to put my life back together. That experience, I must tell you, was the first time, and it amazed me as I think back on this, first time that I confronted in a real way the oppression of women in our society. I had worked in the civil rights movement. I'd been an activist since I was very early, very young, in my early teens, in other social justice, civil rights causes. I had obviously not been in touch with the issues around women. Well, I got in touch, and I decided then that my commitment to children's lives, and I was a professional in developmental child work, and I created programs for children who were developmentally disabled and abused, that my interest in children and my concern and my horror at the way women were treated had to come together in my professional life, and I decided to devote my life to reproductive rights and health. And I was with Planned Parenthood for 6 years, and now I'm with NARAL. But I want to say about reproductive choice that it's not just abortion. I believe that as a nation we should be making abortion less necessary. Not more dangerous and difficult, but less necessary. I want to challenge us to go beyond abortion to real choice. But I must say that what happens in Congress and what happens in state legislatures really, and what happens at the Supreme Court, are not just abstract laws passed, not abstract decisions rendered by the court. They're real, and they affect our lives. And I believe that if we're not involved in politics to ensure that the laws that are passed are humane and just and respectful, and treat us all as equals and women as equals, we lose as a society. So that's why I'm in the business I'm in. I want this course to be lively and substantive and deep, and I want it to be challenging. I want us to challenge ourselves and not just assume that we all think the same way about all the complex and discrete issues involved in reproductive choice. So I ask you to come and challenge me, and I'm going to have opposing sides represented as well.
Thank you, Kate. In the Institute Fellows Program, we always try to have a journalist in this group. We have two this time. One, a holdover from last semester, Florence Graves, whom many of you have gotten to know. She's the founder of Common Cause magazine and is now writing a book on the relationship, the power relationship between women and men in Washington. She broke the Bob Packwood story in the Washington Post and is staying in the Institute again this semester and will be available to you. Our new journalist is Victor Navasky, who is certainly not new to journalism. For many years, since 1978, he has been editor of The Nation, the oldest weekly magazine in the country. He's here to write about these journals of opinion and how they fit into a mass media culture in the United States. And I'm sure his investigation of journals of opinion and his study group will lead to the explanation of some of his own personal opinion on these issues that he's been writing about for so many years. So we're very pleased and honored to have Victor Navasky with us as an Institute Fellow.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, and you can see why I appreciate my colleagues on the platform. Let's see, last night a young man from the Kennedy School came up to me and he said, he stuck out his hand with this big smile on his face. He said, "I'm the token leftist at the Kennedy School." So I was very happy to meet him. Although it happened that he was the third person who told me that he was the token leftist. So by my sampling, my theory of sampling, there must be a majority. No, I don't know how you project that into the thing, but I don't know how that relates to the undergraduate school. But it made me think that I really never, or it's not that I never did, but that I didn't used to think of myself as a leftist. Shortly after I came to The Nation, we had a mole at Time magazine, and they had written a story about The Nation magazine, and our mole sent us an advance galley. And in the story, it referred to the liberal magazine, The Nation. And the editor-in-chief had crossed out the word liberal and in the margin written leftist, as if to punish us for our sins. So it made me, and the request that we come here this evening and talk about where we got our political perspectives, think back. And the earliest that I can remember is that I learned my politics from folk songs. And I was thinking that when I was in camp, I don't know how old I was, but you can tell from what I'm about to tell you when it happened, because it was before World War II, I guess. I was walking with some counselors, and they were having an argument about whether it was right or wrong to sing these political folk songs when we couldn't possibly understand what they were talking about. Well, I don't know what the songs were about, and they asked me what I thought about a particular song, and I said I liked the song. And I'm now going to subject you to one verse of that song, and you'll see what I mean.
No.
'Twas on a Saturday night when the moon was shining bright, and they signed the conscription bill. The people came to town from many miles around to see the president and the boys on Capitol Hill. Oh, Franklin Roosevelt told the people what he felt. These are the words he said: "I hate war, and so does Eleanor, but we won't be safe till everybody's dead." Now, you can see why I'm not going to make folk singing part of my study group. But I got my first real political experience, if you don't count. I actually came up to this area, and a classmate was running for the town council in Brookline, And his campaign manager, who was in the class below me at Swarthmore College, was a young fellow named Michael Dukakis. And he got our classmate elected and started his own career at that point. But I got my own first exposure to politics in 1959 when I was working for the governor of Michigan, a fellow named Soapy Williams, who was a great civil rights advocate. And he lent me out to John Kennedy's Civil Rights Unit during the campaign of 1960 for president. And I remember I was very stirred when Kennedy would go into black neighborhoods and campaign for civil rights and say that the president, President Eisenhower, could eliminate all segregation in housing with the stroke of his pen. Then he got elected president, and it took him a year went by and he didn't stroke his pen. By this time, I was putting out a small magazine of political satire called Monocle, as in Monocle, our motto was, "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." We called ourselves a leisurely quarterly of political satire because we came out twice a year at the beginning. Eventually, we came out like the UN police force whenever there was an emergency and whenever we could solve the financial crisis. And changed our name. We called ourselves a Radical Sporadical. But we started the Ink for Jack campaign, and because our theory was that the White House had run out of ink, and we urged all of our subscribers to send a bottle of ink to the White House so that he could have the ink to sign the order that would eliminate segregation in all publicly assisted housing. And one day I got a letter from Pierre Salinger, who was then the White House press secretary, saying that it was messing up the White House mailroom, that these bottles of ink were breaking, would we please cease and desist? And we said, all he has to do is sign this order. And he, sure enough, a year and a half later, he signed the order. And and CORE adopted our slogan, and we take credit for that. But my next experience came again through the magazine. By 1964, it was the height of the civil rights movement, and it was something we cared about. And we decided to run one of our editors for president, and he was the only Republican in the office, and he entered the Republican Party running against Barry Goldwater. He entered the Republican primary. And he claimed that Goldwater, who claimed he was a conservative, only went back as far as McKinley. And our man, Marvin Kipman, ran on Abraham Lincoln's platform of 1864. He went all the way back to Lincoln. And his platform called for the unconditional surrender of the South, the freeing of the slaves, and the reinforcement of the garrison at Fort Sumter. And also, he said, as a writer, he'd rather be president than write. And so we put him up there and went up to New Hampshire. And he did pretty well up there, actually. He got something like 63 write-in votes, which was more than Governor Scranton of Pennsylvania got, who was a frequently mentioned candidate. Now, at that point, we started, there was a famous newsletter called the Insider's Newsletter, and it was the equivalent, I guess, of some of these programs you see on television today, hard copy, current affairs, whatever they are, and it purported to give you all this inside gossip. And our theory was that there was an information surplus and that you didn't need that. And so we put out something called the Outsider's Newsletter, which only reported on what was not going on. And our theory was by telling people what was not going on, they could figure out what was going on. And we did that for a while, and for one reason or another, neither of these publications survived. I leave it to you to figure this out. And I was forced to go to work for the New York Times magazine. As you can see, I am a magazine addict, and I don't know how it happened, but I don't seem to be able to stay away from them. And when I was there, I didn't think of the magazine as having any particular ideology. I thought we judged things on the merits, and we did judge things on the merits. I think of The Nation as a magazine that judges things on the merits. But I subsequently came to conclude about my experience at the Times that the Times and the networks and the Boston Globe and the Harvard Crimson and the Independent all have an ideology. And the difference between the ideology of a magazine like The Nation, which is said to be on the left, and we'll talk about that in our study group, and a magazine like National Review, which is said to be on the right, and we're having the editor of National Review come to our study group, and the New York Times or the Washington Post, is not that the Times and the Washington Post have no ideology. It's that they have the ideology of the center, and that since so many of us are in the center, it's hard to know what it is, and to be conscious of what the values are beyond which you think someone has an ideology. So it is part of the ideology of the center, in my view, to deny that one has an ideology. And that's one of the paradoxes of the mainstream media, and it's one of the opportunities for the journal of opinion, which as a genre is open about its own political values and ideas. Now, I took a year off from the Nation for a variety of reasons. One of them is that I've been doing this thing for 16 years, and I thought the magazine would benefit from it, and I would benefit from it. And I had this other project I wanted to do, and I wanted to come here and think about the role of these entities in this age of the so-called superhighway and electronic conglomerated transnational journalistic monoliths. But it's also an interesting time politically, I assume not just for a journal like ours, but particularly for a journal like ours. So let me just mention the one fact about it, and these are some of the themes that will emerge as we consider the role of these magazines. If we were talking 4 or 5 years ago, I could say to you, if you went down our masthead, even though there's a lot of disagreement, both within our office, within our staff, and outside of it by the contributing editors we have who are scattered across the country, there was basically a consensus on every major issue that faced our country, and internationally as well. There was a consensus on choice. It was a good thing. There was a consensus that there ought to be a nuclear freeze. There was a consensus that we shouldn't aid the Contras. There was a consensus, you name the issue, and I will tell you that there was a consensus that we shouldn't go into the Gulf in our magazine. If you went down our masthead this week, you would find on Bosnia, the staff and the contributing editors are split about 50-50. On Somalia, they are split about 50-50. On NAFTA, they were 75% against, 25% for. On the Middle East Peace Accord, they were about 74 and 30 against. It is in this post-Cold War period, and it is a time for rethinking all of the old assumptions, both in the community of so-called ideological journals and in the community of so-called non-ideological media who have more ideology than the rest of us but don't see it. So thanks. Bye.
I think you'll find that Victor will have an explanation for most things. One of his explanations that I enjoyed the most was the explanation, the answer to the question, why is the Nation the nation's oldest weekly? And he said, because every year since 1865 it has failed to show a profit, which...
Secret of our success.
Secret of your success. Our final fellow to speak comes really from... it comes the least distance to speak tonight. And she's not here because we can save some money on the housing allowance. Alice Wolfe is the former mayor of Cambridge. She has one of the most interesting and most difficult jobs in American politics, that of being mayor, has held that job. I got to know the worth and depth of her experience when at the National League of Cities, she, along with Mayor Norm Rice, the fellow who succeeded me in Seattle, chaired a national task force on families and children, and tried to focus the attention of cities and city policymakers, urban policymakers, on this issue of the child. Her study group will focus on the question, or on the statement, it takes a village to raise a child, and she brings a political experience that goes from school committee to City Hall to national policy making stage to make that a most interesting study group. Please welcome Alice Wolfe.
Thank you. I like this national policy making stage. We'd like more of that.
Well, you can see that Harvard is not quite as PC as people have said, because we still have the ability today to speak in alphabetic order, and they've not yet found out that the people at the end of the alphabet are discriminated against. We're always
challenged.
last, but not first, but not least. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you today. I have the distinction, apart from my fellows, that I have some of my constituents and supporters in the room, and they're here to make sure that I've continued my long tradition of telling the truth. And I'm looking forward very much to this term, and particularly working with all of the people on the stage. As you can see, we already share something in common. We have a common cold. And but we've already started to talk about some things that are very interesting, and I think we'll have a wonderful time. My study group, as you've heard, is going to be around the issue of children in the community. And this is an issue that I have followed since about 20 years ago. I ran first for the Cambridge School Committee, a distinction, I might say, I share with our beloved former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who was also a member of the Cambridge School Committee, and with Kim Campbell, who started her career on the school board. And I've maintained this interest through my 20-year career in local office. And I now I pursue it not as some of my detractors might have said, to have something to write on my campaign literature, but because I feel that this country is in big, big trouble with regard to what is happening with our children. And I'm not going to go at length. You all know what that trouble is. I see that trouble as connected very much with the possibility that in the course of the next few years, as well as the next few decades, we are going to become a society that is so split and divided, whether it is by race, whether it is by economics, by opportunity, that it will be like the worst apartheid in South Africa and in other countries. And so I believe, however, that we have to start to deal with this, at least in one area of life, with working with our children and our families, and trying to see that as the children are born, we give the families the kind of support that is necessary to help the families and our communities to nurture these children. And we will be talking about that at length in our study group, and how can we weave a new kind of community around children and families that will enable them to grow up in a way that will be positive for them and positive for our society. I came into politics, I guess you could say, in some respects as a mom, and in some respects as an activist and agitator. The day I made the decision to really get into elective politics was a day that some of the people in the audience will remember, when in our city, the school committee, which had promised to give citizens such as myself the opportunity to help select a superintendent of schools, instead voted to put in the acting superintendent, the insider, as the superintendent of schools. And as I sat in the auditorium, at that time the Ringe Auditorium, which is now Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, I said, okay, it's politics where it's at. I have to become involved in politics if I want to change the way schools are governed. And so I did not immediately run for office, but at the next opportunity worked for candidates for the school committee who were pledged to reopen the citizen participation process and selected a superintendent of schools in the way that had been promised, and in the way in which I felt it would be to the most benefit of the school system and to my children and everybody else's children. And we won that election campaign, and the superintendent, in fact, was changed. And the following 2 years later, I ran for office myself and was elected on that time to the Cambridge School Committee, where I served for 8 years. And then after a loss, for the first time I ran for the city council by 163 votes. I can even remember the number. I was elected 2 years later and served for 10 years as city councilor and as mayor of the city in which you are now sitting. The other basis, I think, for my participation in many of the activities which I have been active, and which include a variety of things in the Democratic Party. I've been to several national conventions. I was a Kennedy delegate in 1980 and a Mondale delegate in 1984 and so forth. I think relates in a more sort of deep way to my roots as a refugee in the United States. I came with my parents just before the Second World War as a Jewish family. We fled from Vienna, Austria, which the Nazis had occupied, and where at that time little Jewish children could no longer go and play in the parks, and where my grandmother was subsequently killed in a concentration camp. And I think somewhere, although this isn't sort of intellectually how I got to this place, somewhere from that background, I have developed a very deep sense of how we must certainly fight all injustice, but also where we have to make a difference. And we have to see that the government is not the kind of place that the Nazi government was, that the Nazis were, but is a kind of place that supports its populace, it supports its people. And I have sort of a very much a sense that that can happen, but it can only happen if we are active, if we care, and if we work together as a community to see that we are the kind of people that nurture each other and care for each other. In that, I think that local government has a lot to be said for it. As I said, I've spent 20 years in local government and have found, which I think Charlie Royer can certainly support, that at the local level, there is a sort of a bonding between the citizenry and the local officials that can make the government work, you know, in a way that is very responsive. And I know, of course, that many people talk about the hacks of the local government and the city government as hackorama. Yes, we have problems sometimes around those things. You know, I've often said that the liberals finally found a response to patronage. It's called networking. But the capacity at the local government to make a difference, I think, is very, very important. It is also a place where people who, and I must say I did not get into it this way, but people who are interested in becoming politically involved and even rising into political office can get very good roots, very good understanding of how the government can work. Yesterday, I took Bo down to the State House. Bo did not believe that there were Republicans in Massachusetts. And so I had been invited to a meeting at which I thought the governor, but then the lieutenant governor was to chair. And so I said, Bo, come to the State House with me and come and see Republicans who are even in power in this state. So we went down to the State House, and on the way back in the subway, we were standing there in a very crowded subway because, unfortunately, there had been a tie-up on the Red Line, and it was very, very crowded. We were standing there like sardines, and the gentleman who was standing opposite me as we were holding on said, "Oh, Alice Wolf, I'm so glad to see you." And then started to talk to me about an issue that he had written to me about, I would say 6 or 8 years ago. And actually when he spoke with me, I didn't know immediately who he was. But as soon as he told me what the issue was, I knew exactly who he was. And he talked at great length about that work and the other things I had done. And there is a capacity to walk on the street and to well, you can hardly walk in the supermarket because a walk in the supermarket usually means 2 or 3 hours solving a few constituent issues. But there is a real opportunity at the local level, I think, to work on a variety of issues. And some of the things that I was involved with during my time on both the school committee and the city council were things such as rebuilding our high school. And I'm thrilled that my student liaison for my study group is a graduate of Cambridge Rindge and Latin School. And that's going to be a lot of fun for me. We did the controlled choice desegregation plan, which has now become a model around the country, and I might say several people got their PhDs, I think, at Harvard on the work that I did. I was involved and was a leader in a human rights ordinance, and recently passed domestic partners ordinance. We created the Kids Council, which is leading the issues around children in the city. Worked on a number of environmental issues. We were one of the few cities that declared ourselves a sanctuary city in 1985 when El Salvadoran refugees were not being given political asylum when other refugees were being given political asylum. And we've done a number of other innovative actions which a lot of people thought were not what local government would do, but in fact were appropriate and worked very well in that environment. So I am very pleased to be here to have the opportunity after 20 years to sit back a little bit and schmooze and to work with students particularly and to look at some of the issues around children in the community and see also whether we can't get some of the young people who are here at the school to come and work in government, run for office, become president. One of them told us yesterday that was his ambition, and I hope that we can inspire our students to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. We have time for a few questions. There are microphones on either side here of the main floor. So just if you would kindly identify yourselves and direct your question, we'll take a few.
Good evening. My name's Melissa Liasis. I'm an undergraduate here at Harvard and a member of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics. My question is actually for Ms. Michaelman in regards to the recent Supreme Court decision in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, in which they struck down some restrictions such as spousal notification, but upheld 24-hour waiting period, consent for minors, etc. I wanted to hear what you and your group thought about that and what, if anything, you were doing to fight against them.
I'm very glad you asked the question because I have been extremely distressed since the summer of ‑92 and how the press has treated the Casey decision. I really believe the court issued a very political decision. It was, I believe, this is Kate Michaelman speaking, not necessarily NARAL, but I really believe that there was a concern in terms of the uproar or the explosion, if you will, the firestorm that would have occurred if they had outright said they were overturning Roe, and George Bush's politics were involved. So what the court did was overturn Roe, but not say it was overturning Roe. And today, poor rural young women are faced with humiliating barriers that they have to overcome in order to exercise their right to choose that would never have been upheld by the court under Roe. The same restrictions that the court upheld in the Casey decision were struck down by previous courts under the standard of Roe, that the state cannot interfere in a woman's decision unless it had a compelling state interest after viability particularly. So I believe the Casey decision was devastating. I believe that it really did take away the protections that were recognized as necessary for reproductive freedom and women's choice in this country, and we are confronted now with the Supreme Court having opened the door to state legislatures year after year, legislature after legislature, session after session, passing laws that will indeed deny women their access to this vital choice. So what NARAL is having to do, number one, is fight at all these state levels, all these restrictions. In fact, we now have Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio ready this moment to put into force waiting periods. People say, well, what's wrong with a woman having to wait 24 hours or 48 hours? Well, in Mississippi, women are having to drive hundreds of miles, poor women, sleep in their cars while they're waiting for the 24 hours to pass. Anti-choice forces are tracking their license plate numbers, reporting them back to their ministers in their homes. It's a horrible situation. It's devastating. It's humiliating. We're having to fight now at all the state levels to prevent this kind of imposition of the state governments into women's choices. I really believe that we need a federal law like the Freedom of Choice Act, which NARAL supports very strongly, that restores the protections we've lost, restores the protections granted in Roe that we've lost after the Supreme Court has taken away those protections. We also need as a nation to turn our attention to prevention. That I think the answer to abortion is prevention. It's not taking away the choice from women who face crisis pregnancies, and we're not doing a good job in making abortion less necessary. But on the political level, we've got to pass the Freedom of Choice Act. We have to fight the state laws. We've got to arouse a complacent people who think that now we have a pro-choice administration, all is well on the home front here. All is not well. Clinic violence is on the uprise, as you know. So there's a lot to do, but Casey was devastating, and I think most people believe the court reaffirmed Roe versus Wade. All the court did in Casey was to say Louisiana's criminal laws will not stand. We will.
Is a love-hate relationship.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Dave Bonfili, and I'm an undergraduate here. I'd like to direct this question to Ms. Campbell and Mr. Bolter. I picked up my mail yesterday, and there was a copy of Newsweek in it, and it had an article on the recent market attack in Bosnia. And there was a long article on U.S., primarily, efforts to deal with the situation and kind of the lack of any sort of coherent plan for doing so. I wondered if the two of you could comment on what you see as the future of America and Canada's actions in that region in the near future.
Want me to start?
Well,
We have
I don't
troops
care
on
who
the ground
starts. Yeah, you do. You've got considerations that we don't have. I just know that I'm not going to make any big policy statement. I'm going to make a statement that I would have made if I were still in Congress to the people that I might represent. And that is that if I cannot give a good explanation of why some American boy had to die there, then I could not really vote to send.
Highly disproportionate to our population, and we have been there. Another thing that I would just say in looking at this issue, there was a very good article in the Boston Globe today, which I commend to you, by Nick Gowie, who is a fellow at the very long name
Shorenstein?
Shorenstein, Barone Institute in the Press.
Marvin's place.
Marvin Kalb's place, on the dangers of assessing situations from the nature of real-time television broadcasting. That the situation in the former Yugoslavia, the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is much more complex than what you see on CNN, not because CNN attempts to distort things, but because there isn't the same access to footage and filming all throughout that area as there is in Sarajevo. And so one has to be very careful not to be precipitated into a policy position on such a very important issue simply by the nature of the coverage. That is an enormously difficult issue. It has been estimated that it would take over 200,000 ground troops in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, to create order there. There are no countries who are willing to put forward that kind, and the United States would have to become involved. And I think the point that Bolter makes is a very good one. It is a very difficult situation. I think we are going to be analyzing it and reanalyzing it for years to come. When the Vance-Owen plan looked like it might be a go, it was estimated that about 55 to 75,000 troops would be needed. I was our Minister of Defense at that time. And the Secretary General of NATO canvassed the NATO countries to see how many troops might in fact be available to police the Vance-Owen plan. That would be a peace plan. And a tiny percentage of what was estimated to be necessary was being offered by the NATO countries. And so what we have is a lack of political will. But what this issue points out, and I'm not trying if airstrikes could be effective, it could happen, but I think it was the new Defense Secretary Perry who said, if this is Act 1 of a new scenario, what is Act 2 and what is Act 3? So the Russians have said that they would respond politically to an attack on the Serbs. It is a very, very complex situation, and people's notion of, the term surgical strike should be struck out of everyone's military lexicon because it doesn't exist. So there is an enormous sense of outrage and frustration. Our troops are there, not even as peacekeepers, so they're on a humanitarian mission. And the troops of Western countries, Canada, France, Britain, and others, have saved lives, they have helped, but they are enormously frustrated. But what it points out is the need for us in the post-Cold War period to create internationally viable and effective instruments to deter aggression and to monitor, and the kind of political will, rules of the game, terms of engagement that will enable the populations of democratic countries, which would be the backbone of any of these organizations, to enable those kinds of forces and institutions to function in this post-Cold War period. We have found ourselves, the United Nations is moribund as a result of the Cold War. It's very weakened. The Secretary General is trying to reform it. When I was a teenager, I used to want to be the first woman Secretary General of the United Nations. And after meeting Mr. Boutros-Ghali, I'm really glad that I went the other route, albeit it had its problems too. It is an enormously difficult situation. So I don't mean to give a long answer to a short question, but I think realistically it's going to be very difficult for the democracies, or the countries of NATO or through the United Nations, to go in and impose order there. A negotiated peace settlement is the only answer. But it is a very frightening situation, and Helmut Kohl made a very interesting point last summer at G7 when he said that what we're seeing is a very dangerous precedent of possibly borders in Europe being changed by force. And that is something that all of us should be very worried about. That is a very dangerous international precedent.
I think this gentleman was up next, and then we'll take you as the final question.
Hello, my name is Zachary Karabel. I'm a National Security Fellow at the Center for International Affairs. I have two related questions, one for Mr. Bolter and one for Mr. Navasky. I assume, Mr. Bolter, that you would probably consider yourself a conservative Republican. I mean, for me, a liberal Republican is a little like a progressive conservative. But wondering
Fine
on your
tradition where I come from.
I know. Sorry. If Mr. Navasky sees a fracturing of consensus on something that has been called the left, I wonder if you have the same perspective on what we traditionally call the right, if there's a fracturing there. The other is, if there is, for Mr. Navasky, if there is a fracturing of this consensus, are these any longer operative categories? I mean, does it mean anything to say the left, the center, or the right anymore? And if so, maybe it's time to sort of scrap these terms and start afresh.
Yeah, good idea.
Well, look, I mean, one reason I chose international trade is because I thought I could avoid these interesting discussions, but no, really. Yeah, I mean, I'm all in favor of scrapping all of those terms. I have personally been, with some accuracy, but a lot of inaccuracy, identified with the religious right throughout my political career. And there is a lot about the religious right that I do not like. But I think that there is a fracture in the right. There are those who align themselves with somebody like Jack Kemp, for example. I think Mickey's doing a course on this or something, and he's the expert on this. But a person like that is more interested in progressive conservatism, a brand of conservatism that tries to recognize that some people are disadvantaged and that government can help them up the ladder, as opposed to people who, on the right, who don't think government should do anything at all. My 14-year-old daughter griped me out last night because she is an extreme right person and she doesn't think government should do anything except build highways and stuff, and I tend to think that there is a role that government can play. And then, of course, there is a split in the conservative community about the social issues, and I don't know that that split's going to go away. But I know one thing, and then I'll shut up as soon as I say this. Even though I deal with international trade here, one of the blessings of being here is to get to know people who are on the other side on many issues from me, like Kate, and I think that we're going to have some common ground, she being on the left of that issue, me being on the right of that issue, but I bet you that we do something together positively that will address the concern that she's articulating, and that is that a failure of our policies in America is one reason why we have so many abortions. And on that, you know, we can agree and we can work together on it.
It's good to see your face. We talked on the phone. There have always been splits on the left, and there has never been a left. There have been a lot of different lefts, and the nation inhabits a part of one of them at this point in history, although I prefer to think of the nation as an independent journal, and the country moved so far to the right that everyone saw it as being on the left during the Reagan years, and in that period it seemed to me a badge of honor to accept that designation rather than being self-designated. I think there's a noble tradition that is part of the left, and that has to do with identification with the dispossessed, and also human rights and civil rights and civil liberty. And that's the left I identify with. I agree with you that the labels don't work now. They never really did. I think what it calls for is more precision in the way people use terms and the way you define what you're talking about when you're talking about it. And there will be new emerging political stances that you will find a new label for that may turn out to be more helpful in discussing particular issues than the old left-right ones. But I don't think scrapping it or turning one's back on the noble part of that tradition is the fix that people are looking for.
You have the final question.
Hi, my question is also for Mr. Navasky. My name is Julie Curtis. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I'm curious about your response to the Bobby Ray Inman allegations about opinion journalism, in effect, interfering detrimentally in political decisions and policy making. He accused opinion journalism of character assassination and contributing to his unsuccessful, or in his mind, his unsuccessful, I guess, consideration for the Secretary of Defense job. What's your response to his allegations, and will you be dealing with those kinds of issues, the role in political decisions of the media?
Well, I have a general response and then a specific observation about what he had to say. My general response to his point is that the press which he was happy with is a press which routinely prints the handouts of the Pentagon and the other places where he was used to working. So of course he was happy with them. I happen to disagree with Bill Safire about many things, but he was unhappy with Bill Safire and Ellen Goodman and whomever else he may have had in mind, because they analyzed and criticized and disagreed with him in a way that he found either unfair or offensive, but it seems to me that they were open and honest about what they had to say. Now, having said that, he did something else there that the Nation happens to have an article on that we ran last week, which may be of interest. He called Sapphire a plagiarist. Sapphire denied it, and Inman sort of backed down. And it was vague when you read what's this all about? And there was some vague reference to something that happened when Sapphire was a PR person many years ago. And if you read the Times, their version differed between two editions. And it turns out what that was about was that Robert Massey, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer now, he wrote Nicholas and Alexandra and King Peter the Great, when he was a young man just out of the Navy and back from his Rhodes Scholarship, went to work for Collier's magazine, and he was working as an assistant to Teddy White. And Bill Sapphire was an account executive at the Tex McCrary Public Relations Agency. And he was trying to promote a story on one of their clients, the new publisher of the Herald Tribune, a fellow named Ogden Brownie Reed. And Teddy White was his target. And Teddy White assigned Massey the job of researching whether or not this fellow was worth a profile. Massey, being a very entrepreneurial, diligent, and scholarly ambitious young journalist, went and interviewed 32 people. And the day he turned in his research memorandum, Collier's went under. So Teddy White said, hey, listen, your memorandum is virtually an article. You ought to publish it. Sapphire, trying to please his client, said to Massey, hey, I can get it published for you. I can give it to the old Saturday Evening Post. I know the people there. Give it to me and I'll place it for you. About a month later, I'm now going to tell Massey's version of what happened. About a month later, it came back with a note from Sapphire saying, I did my best. It didn't work. Sorry. Sapphire then called Teddy White. Teddy White said, put it in the Reporter magazine. Here's a name. He called the Reporter. They published it. X months later, he was sitting in his dentist's office, and he opened a copy of Esquire magazine, or wherever he was sitting, and it named the 10 bright young men of the year. One of them was Ogden Reed, and it said, see our profile of him X months ago. So he, being a curious fellow, went to look at the profile X months ago in Esquire, and there, under another writer's name, were big chunks of his research and some of his writing. And so he called a lawyer and who called Esquire, and the editor of Esquire said, gee, looked at the comparisons and said, we didn't, this is news to us. Why don't we pay you what we would have paid you had we bought your article? Massey, being a person of conscience and also of indignation, was not happy with that, but he by this time was working for Newsweek, and his boss told him, don't make trouble, take the money. The money was twice as much as he was making at Newsweek anyway in a week, so he took the money. He always believed that that what Sapphire had done was he had taken his research, and when he couldn't place it under his name, had given it to this other writer and said, here's research that we have done, taken Massey's name off and given it to the other. You go write it for Esquire, who you've written for before. The other writer assumed it was research done by the agency and published it. Massey takes out his dictionary, says Sapphire is a wordsmith. He should know what plagiarism is. It is taking someone else's work and claiming it's your own. He argues that Sapphire took his work, claimed it was his own. So he then called up Bobby Inman, and he said to him, is the case that you're referring to when you call Sapphire a plagiarist something that I mentioned to you at dinner when we met 12 years ago? Because he could never get it out of his system. And Inman said, yes, it is. And Massey said, well, then you shouldn't have backed down when Sapphire said he never stole anyone else's work, because here's what happened by way of background. So that's a footnote to your question.
Thank you, Victor. Well,
There we let it hang.
part of the mission of the Institute of Politics, big part of the mission of the Institute of Politics, is to act as a bridge between the real world of politics and maybe the sometimes not so real world of the academy. And I think you would agree with me that we have some very interesting people from the real world of politics who've come across that bridge and are available to you here at the Kennedy School and at the university. So please avail yourselves of them, use them, come to their study groups, and they're more than anxious to talk with you and share their experiences. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank our fellows for
Thank you.
this evening.